a place where silence often speaks louder than sound. Have you ever touched something broken? Not to fix it, but just to feel if it still responds? Today's story isn't about a song. It's about a boy who couldn't speak, a waitress who didn't ask for permission, and a piano that had long been forgotten, until one quiet moment brought it back to life. If you believe that broken doesn't mean useless, just misheard. Hit like, tap subscribe, and stay with us till the end. Because what happens when a child with no voice meets an instrument with no sound? Might just echo in you longer than any melody ever could. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it carried the charm of an old soul, the kind of place that had known silence longer than applause. Its lights were soft, yellowed by time rather than design. Tucked against a brick wall near the fireplace sat an upright piano, weathered wooden and wounded. A single crack split across its lid like a scar. A hand-painted sign above the keys read, "Do not touch, out of use." No one ever asked about the piano. It was just there, a relic more than an instrument, exiled to the corner because it no longer served the purpose of beauty. But Jude noticed. He had been staring at it for most of the lunch hour, eyes fixed not on the whole instrument, but a single chipped key, slightly raised, slightly off, like it was trying to speak up through all the silence pressed around it. Jude didn't speak either. 8 years old, pale blonde hair falling into his lashes, Jude had lived every day in quiet. Not by choice, but because his vocal cords had been damaged at birth. He could breathe, but couldn't make words. His left hand, slightly curled from weakened motor function, made most instruments frustrating or dangerous. Still, he watched the piano like it owed him something. Across the room, Delilah Grant noticed. She always noticed the ones who didn't ask for anything. 29 and wearing a name tag she didn't particularly like, Delilah moved through the diner like she didn't belong to it, like someone trying to make herself smaller than the notes she used to play. A decade ago, she had studied music therapy. She loved the idea that sound could heal, that rhythm could make a body remember what it had forgotten. But people wanted results. And healing didn't work on a deadline. So now she worked tables, carried trays, memorized orders, and tried not to flinch when someone asked if she played anything. She had been wiping down a booth when she caught Jude lifting his hand, halfway, then pulling it back like he wasn't sure he was allowed. She crossed the floor slowly, not to surprise him, but to keep him from slipping away. She knelt beside him and looked at the piano, not at him. "Wanna touch it anyway?" she asked quietly. Jude didn't nod. But he didn't look away. There was no music playing in the restaurant. No chatter. Just the low clink of silverware and the faint hum of a ceiling fan. Delilah stood still, letting the moment stretch. She didn't reach for him. Didn't urge. Just waited. Behind them, no one cared about the piano. No one noticed the boy who kept staring at a broken thing like it could answer something for him. Delilah did. Because she knew what it meant to look at something broken, not with the hope of fixing it, but just to see if you were still allowed to touch it. To ask nothing from it but permission. Delilah didn't ask for permission. She simply walked over, hands empty, and crouched beside the boy. The restaurant around them didn't pause, didn't hush. It didn't need to. What she was about to do wasn't loud. She looked at Jude's shoulder, then his eyes, and quietly slipped one arm under his back, the other beneath his knees. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. His eyes, still pinned to the piano, gave her all the answers she needed. She lifted him. Not quickly. Not with effort. But with care, the kind of care that doesn't try to fix, only to carry. Jude was light, but there was weight in the moment, the unspoken question of "Am I allowed to be here?" hanging between them. Delilah stepped toward the piano, stopping just inches from the "Do Not Touch" sign. She didn't read it. Neither did he. She gently set Jude down on the bench, his legs dangling, his posture uncertain, like he didn't quite believe he belonged there. There was no sound. No preparation. No audience. Just the boy, the bench, and the battered piano in front of them. Delilah knelt beside him again, this time facing the keys. "It's okay if nothing sounds," she whispered. "Just feel what moves." Jude looked at her, not directly, but sideways, like he was checking if this was a trick. If she'd stop him the second he tried. She didn't. He raised his right hand, slowly, his wrist trembling slightly as it hovered over the keys. Then, with the softest intent, he pressed one finger onto a cracked ivory note. It didn't play. There was no sound. No vibration. The key gave only the faintest resistance, like a memory being touched, not recalled. But Jude didn't move away. He didn't pull back. His chest rose, just a little. His eyelids fluttered shut. His hand remained, finger resting firmly but gently on that one broken note. Delilah didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her role had ended the moment she stepped back and let him take the seat. What happened now wasn't about her. It wasn't about anyone else either. It was about Jude. A boy who had never been asked what he wanted to touch. Who had only ever been handed things designed to work. Instruments with precision, instructions with outcomes, therapies with charts. But now, there was no outcome expected. No music to produce. No one waiting for a melody. Just a silent boy and a silent piano. And the space between them beginning to hum in a way only they could feel. Behind them, a couple laughed over their drinks. A fork clinked against a plate. Life went on. But at that bench, something else was starting, not a performance, not a practice, but a presence. Jude's left hand stayed curled in his lap, as if unsure of its place. But his right remained extended, index finger pressing down on the lifeless key with a kind of quiet insistence. Delilah watched his shoulders, the slight loosening of tension, the way he tilted his head, the rhythmless stillness that somehow felt like music. She thought of all the children she had studied with, all the hours spent trying to coax progress out of pain. She thought of the charts, the rubrics, the frustrated supervisors. None of them would have counted this. But Delilah did. Because something moved. Not the key. Not the piano. Not even the room. But Jude. He wasn't playing a song. He was being allowed to play for the first time, without being corrected, redirected, or judged. Delilah stayed crouched for a moment longer, just long enough to see him breathe. Then she rose and stepped back. She didn't ask if he wanted to continue. She didn't say good job or try another. There were no instructions, no encouragement, no false praise. There was only space. And that, sometimes, was more sacred than sound. Everett Knox stepped into the restaurant with the phone still in his hand and his jaw set like a man who hadn't lost a negotiation in years. He had just left a lunchtime investor call, another round of talk about growth metrics, scalable strategies, predictable outcomes. The usual. It was what he did best: measure things. Calculate risks. Define value. That's why he spotted the anomaly instantly. Across the room, just beyond the hostess stand, sat his son, alone, on the bench of a piano Everett didn't remember being relevant to this establishment. The piano looked broken. Dusty. Some kind of sign taped to it. And yet Jude was touching it. He moved toward the boy with purpose, each step slow but loaded. His expensive shoes tapped against the tile like a metronome out of sync with the scene in front of him. This was not part of the plan. Everett hadn't spent thousands on occupational therapists and developmental programs for Jude to be left fiddling with a piece of junk in public. He didn't bring his son here to waste time on relics. They came for lunch, not lessons. And certainly not whatever this was. As he approached, he prepared to speak, not harshly but firmly. To tell Jude it was time to go. That this wasn't safe. That there were better ways to spend his effort. That this wasn't worth it. Then she stepped between them. Delilah. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't block his path with force. She simply stood in front of the boy, one palm open as if offering an invisible pause button. "Please," she said softly. One more minute. Everett blinked, surprised by her nerve. He opened his mouth, but she continued, calm but clear. He's not asking to be heard, she said. He's asking to stay. The words hit like a low chord struck somewhere deep inside him, one that hadn't been played in years. He looked past her, at Jude, whose finger still rested on the cracked key. The boy didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge him. His eyes were closed, his chest rising gently, as if each breath was trying to memorize what it felt like to simply be there. No sound. No song. Just presence. Everett hesitated. There was nothing productive about this. Nothing measurable. No outcome to log. No benefit he could chart. And yet, he stepped back, just half a pace. Not because he understood. Not yet. But because something in the way the boy sat there, so still, so focused, so unaware of expectation, felt like truth. Not his truth, but someone's. Everett had built an empire on knowing what to do next. But in that moment, he realized he didn't know how to calculate this. There was no formula for a child choosing silence. No ROI for letting something broken be touched. He looked at the waitress again. She hadn't moved. She wasn't performing. There was no proud gleam in her eyes. No expectation for thanks or recognition. Just stillness. Stillness guarding stillness. Everett put his phone in his pocket. He didn't say anything. Didn't nod. But he also didn't interrupt. He turned slightly to the side, letting the distance between him and the bench stretch, not with defeat, but with surrender. Not of control, but of assumption. And as he stood there, watching his son do absolutely nothing productive with a piano that offered absolutely nothing back, he felt something he hadn't budgeted for. He felt cracked. Just a little. Like maybe a part of him had finally stopped holding its breath. That night, Everett heard a soft tapping. Not the rhythmic click of a metronome, not the flutter of pages being turned. It was uneven, scattered, like thoughts dropped one by one onto a surface too fragile to hold them. He followed the sound through the hallway, past the library, to the far end of the dining room where the long oak table sat under a chandelier that hadn't been lit in years. Jude was there, seated at the head of the table in his pajamas, feet barely touching the floor. In front of him lay a worn pencil box, its corners split open, filled not with sharpened pencils, but broken halves. Eraserless, splintered, dull. He had one in each hand. And he was tapping. Not in any beat Everett could recognize. Not even in consistent rhythm. It was soft. Almost absent-minded. One tap, pause, then two quick ones, then silence again. But Everett saw it clearly. Jude wasn't looking for music. He was feeling something. The boy's eyes were fixed on the wood grain of the table, but his hands were in motion, searching, touching, returning. There was no melody. No noise to enjoy. No crescendo or release. Just contact. A fragile conversation between his skin and the surface. Everett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, unsure whether to interrupt. He didn't. He remembered the piano. The broken key. The way Jude hadn't asked for permission or praise. The stillness of his back. The pressure in that finger, resting. After a while, Jude looked up and noticed him. The boy didn't flinch or hide the pencils. He simply paused, waiting. Everett walked over slowly, then sat across from him. No words yet. He watched as Jude placed both pencils down, aligning them carefully, like twin batons waiting for a conductor who might never come. Then Everett spoke. "Do you want sound?" The question came out softer than he expected. Not because he doubted the answer, but because, suddenly, he wasn't sure it mattered. Jude reached for the small whiteboard they kept in the kitchen drawer, slid it toward himself, and uncapped the blue marker. His handwriting was slow, a little uneven, but legible. "No. I want to move things." Everett read the words twice. He didn't know if his son meant objects, people, or feelings? He didn't ask. Because something inside him knew the answer was yes to all of them. Jude picked the pencils back up and tapped again, once, then again, then let them rest. Everett watched his son's hands, how intentional the movement was, even without result. There was no performance here. No audience. No expectation to succeed. Only process. He suddenly realized how many times he had mistaken progress for purpose. How many hours he'd spent charting therapy milestones, looking for indicators that Jude was advancing. How often he'd seen silence as absence, instead of presence. But now, in this quiet dining room with no music, no teachers, and no goals, Jude was doing more than he ever had in a structured environment. He was initiating, exploring, leading. Everett took a breath. He wanted to say something profound, to acknowledge the shift. But he didn't. Because that would have broken the silence Jude had chosen. So instead, he picked up one of the broken pencils, held it between two fingers, and gently tapped the table once. Jude looked at him. Just for a second. Then gave the faintest smile, small, but certain. They sat there a while longer. Not communicating. Not creating. Just connecting. And maybe, Everett thought, that was movement enough. Everett hadn't planned to return to the restaurant. He rarely visited the same place twice unless there was a standing reservation or a business advantage. But today, he wasn't wearing a suit, and his calendar was cleared for the morning. Delilah wasn't hard to find. She moved with a kind of quiet focus, neither hurried nor idle. Just aware. She was refilling water glasses when she saw him. Her shoulders tensed for half a second, but she didn't flinch. He gestured subtly toward the back. Not rudely. Just, directly. She nodded, handed her tray to another waitress, and walked over. They stood near the fireplace, where the old upright piano sat exactly as it had been, dusty, silent, broken. Everett folded his arms, his tone controlled but carrying the weight of something he hadn't quite identified. "Do you think letting him play a broken piano was helpful?" he asked. Not confrontational. But not casual either. Delilah didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the piano, then at Everett, and held his gaze, not with challenge, but with clarity. "No," she said. Everett raised an eyebrow, a little surprised by the bluntness. "But," she continued, her voice steady, "it was the first time he wasn't corrected. Or redirected. Or told to try something else." She paused, then added, "And he got to stay anyway." The words didn't land like an argument. They landed like truth. Small. Inarguable. Sharp. Everett looked back at the piano. The cracked wood. The chipped keys. The tape over the lid. It hadn't moved. No one had touched it since Jude. And yet, it felt different now. He realized, with a quiet thud in his chest, that he hadn't once considered replacing it. He had replaced everything else, furniture, tutors, specialists, even entire schools, whenever progress stalled or results fell short. To him, broken meant inefficient. And inefficient meant it had to go. But this piano? He had walked past it for years without noticing. Now, it had become the most immovable thing in the room. He looked at Delilah again, and for the first time, he didn't see her as staff. Or as someone interfering. He saw her as someone who had given Jude something Everett hadn't known how to offer. Space. Not permission to succeed. But permission to be unfixed, unmeasured, unedited. Everett's lips parted slightly, then closed again. He had no rebuttal. No critique. Just the strange sensation of being undone in a way that wasn't unpleasant, only unfamiliar. Delilah didn't push the moment. She didn't look proud or vindicated. She simply nodded once, as if to say, "That's all. That's enough." Everett gave a slow breath. The kind of breath you take not because you're winded, but because you realize you've been holding something too tight, for too long. "I didn't mean to," he started, but the sentence went nowhere. Delilah gently shook her head. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "You just didn't stay long enough to see what he was doing right." Everett looked down at his hands. They felt too full for someone who had come here with nothing. The piano creaked faintly as the building settled. No one touched it. No one needed to. Some things didn't ask to be played. They just needed not to be thrown away. It had been a week since Everett last saw the piano. A week since that quiet moment by the fireplace, since the conversation that didn't end with a solution, only a silence that lingered longer than he expected. He'd gone back to his meetings, his numbers, his projections. But something followed him. Not in his pocket. Not on paper. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere he couldn't quite quantify. It wasn't guilt. He'd long since learned how to quiet that. It wasn't inspiration. That was for visionaries and risk-takers. It was a question. One that refused to phrase itself in the language he was fluent in: outcome, asset, return. Late one evening, after Jude had gone to sleep, 2 pencils still tucked beneath his pillow, Everett sat in front of his laptop. His desk was clear. His mind wasn't. He clicked open a new message window and typed. Subject: a thought. Do you think? If we moved the piano to the center of the room? And maybe left a few chairs around it? For kids who don't usually get to play. He stared at the message. It wasn't polished. It wasn't persuasive. But it felt honest, like a door cracked open rather than kicked wide. He hit send. And for once, didn't expect an answer. He shut his laptop, exhaled slowly, and turned off the light. The reply came the next morning. No greeting. No explanation. Just an image. It was Jude, not at the restaurant, but at home, sitting at the kitchen table. 2 fists lightly tapping a wooden surface. His eyes were down, but his mouth was slightly open, like he was counting in his head. There was no piano. No audience. Just rhythm. Under the photo, Delilah had written, "They're already playing. We're the ones not listening." Everett stared at the screen longer than he should have. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. The image said everything. About Jude. About the piano. About what Delilah had done, and what he hadn't. It wasn't about creating opportunity. It was about recognizing the ones already being taken quietly, without permission or applause. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded. For so long, he'd viewed music as output. As product. Something to be heard, judged, recorded. But Jude didn't play to be heard. He played to feel movement, to feel agency. Even if the sound never came. And now Everett understood. The piano hadn't needed to be fixed. He had. Or rather, his understanding of what it meant to offer space had needed a crack. And Delilah had handed him the first one. He clicked reply, typed only 2 words. "I'm listening." Then closed the laptop again. The room had no microphones. No amplifiers. No speakers. Just a circle of wooden chairs arranged on a scuffed maple floor, a single upright piano in the center, the same broken one from the restaurant, its splintered finish now polished but still unapologetically cracked. There was no stage. No curtain. Just space. The walls were painted in soft grays, lit by natural light that filtered through long windows. It was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that listens, not waits. On the front of the building, the sign read, "Touch Sound." A place for children who couldn't speak, or chose not to. A place where music was not something you heard, but something you felt. It had been Delilah's idea, but Everett had made it possible, not with a check, but with his presence. They were co-founders in title, but more than that, co-listeners. 2 people who had come to understand that sound was never the only way something could be heard. Today was their first open session. Jude sat on the piano bench, small hands resting gently on the top board. He didn't try to open the lid or press the keys. He simply lifted both palms, placed them flat against the wood, and tapped. Once. Then twice. A pause. Then again. The rhythm wasn't sharp. It didn't echo. It didn't build toward anything. But it moved, not through air, but through bodies. Across the circle, 5 other children sat in silence. They weren't instructed. They hadn't rehearsed. But slowly, instinctively, they began to move. One girl rocked slightly side to side. A boy closed his eyes and started tapping his heel. Another lifted his hands, fingers twitching in slow time. None of them made a sound. But together, something was being played. Delilah stood against the wall, watching, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She didn't lead. She didn't intervene. This wasn't a classroom. There were no grades here. Only pulse. Only presence. Everett sat in a corner chair, back straight, unsure at first if he was part of this space. But then he saw Jude glance up, not at him but toward him, as if to say, "You don't have to understand this. You just have to let it be." And Everett did. For all his years chasing perfection, he had never felt a moment this complete, not because it was polished, but because it asked for nothing. Jude continued tapping. No one clapped. No one spoke. But the room grew full, not with sound, but with shared rhythm. With breath aligned. With stillness that wasn't empty, but alive. The floor seemed to breathe. The piano, long silenced, gave back its resonance, not through notes, but through connection. Through hands that touched not to produce, but to remember. This was not a recital. This was a return. To something older than music. Older than language. The simple act of being allowed to play, without having to earn it. Jude finished his pattern with a slow press of his palm, then rested both hands in his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply looked around the room, and saw 5 other children, all still. But changed. So was Everett. He looked at Delilah, who met his gaze with a knowing softness. They had not built a program. They had built a space. And today, that was enough. Sometimes, the most powerful things in life are the ones we can't hear. This story reminds us that not everything broken needs to be fixed. Not every silence is empty. And not every child needs a voice to be understood. In a world that moves fast and values noise, speed, and results, it's easy to forget the quiet spaces, the moments when someone simply wants to be allowed to stay. Everett, a man who built his life on outcomes, had to watch his son sit in front of a piano that no longer worked, and realize that presence can be more healing than sound. That stillness is not the opposite of progress. Sometimes, it's the beginning of it. Jude didn't ask to be heard, he asked not to be moved. And through his quiet persistence, he reminded the adults around him that value isn't always something you can measure or explain. Sometimes, value is just being allowed to try. For those of us who've lived through decades of fixing, solving, correcting, perhaps it's time to ask, when was the last time you simply listened? To someone? To something? To yourself? You don't need to play loudly to be felt. You just need to make room for what moves you. Because even the softest rhythm, if given space, can still change a room. If you've ever hesitated to touch something broken, remember this. Some pianos don't need to be tuned. Because what they offer isn't sound, but connection. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us in the comments. Have you ever sat in front of something no longer useful, only to realize it was exactly where you were meant to begin?